So hello again. Today we mark the end of our Easter Octave Reflections, and I'd like to invite you to do a kind of summary with me of the fruits of what we've been praying. You know, in our prayer life, it's always useful or helpful to recap what we've been praying and to draw out the different lights that we have understood from the Holy Spirit. So in this sense, then we can try to make it more concrete, to make concrete options of how we can grow in our Christian life. So in this summary, I'd just like to repeat a few questions that could bring us to reflect on what Jesus has been telling us, believing that He is risen, and He's talking about different dimensions, very specific dimensions of our Christian lives. Now the title, but before that, just a little bit of instruction or if you like, spiritual motivation of why we do this. So we've been talking about putting order to our Christian hope, and I would like to give a title to this week. You can give a title to yourself also. I think that's the beauty of making a summary of what really can represent your experience for this week. So the title I gave to myself for this Octave Reflections is The Journey from Galilee to the World. The journey from Galilee to the world. Why do I say that? Because of the readings from Monday and today, Saturday, of the Octave. So Monday we heard how Jesus told the women to tell his brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will meet him. So Galilee meaning the different dimensions of ordinary life, that Christianity is not only meant to be lived in church. Christianity is meant to be lived in our daily lives, also going to Galilee. And during the week from Tuesday to Friday, we have seen different dimensions of our lives. Now I might just go through that a bit in the way of doing the summary. But just to say on this day, on Saturday, the Gospel, which was Mark 16, 9 to 15, talks about Jesus, if you read the Gospel itself, it's a summary of all the different resurrection experiences. It's very beautiful. It's as if this whole week was organized according to the account of the Gospel of Mark. It talks about Mary, it talks about the disciples in Emmaus, etc. And it finishes with Jesus giving what we call the supreme commandment to his disciples as a resurrected Christ. Go out to the whole world and proclaim the good news. So from Galilee, when he appears to them, he's preparing them to go to the world. By meditating on the different dimensions of our Christian life, we are allowing Jesus to prepare us to be these prophets of hope in the world. And if we take this seriously and try to work out these different dimensions and the things that we understood, I would believe that it will really prepare us to face the different situations that will come after this pandemic. We know that this pandemic situation is not perhaps going to be a short-term thing, but Jesus is preparing us interiorly, providentially during this octave or this Lent and Easter season to prepare our hearts to face the challenges. So now, what are those dimensions? And I would like to summarize them in the four questions, or the four main questions that Jesus asked the people he met in these 4 days of encounter. Okay, if you remember, so I'm talking about Tuesday to Friday. On Tuesday, he met Mary Magdalene in John 20. Now, that was the first one. And the question was, "Woman, why are you weeping?" So with this question, "Why are you weeping?" It was an invitation to put order to our own personal lives, to learn how to identify our own personal feelings, our thoughts, and our needs as well. So to identify the reasons why we are weeping inside, why we have fears, why we have anxieties, or overly worried about certain things, or we feel sad excessively in this situation, to identify it. And if you remember, the slogan was, "Name it, claim it, and tame it with Jesus." So that could be the first summary question. Why are you weeping? What makes you weep during this time, try to recall them again and to write them down and to become aware of how you can work through these things, work them out. Just to give you more details, if you like, they could be on the level of thoughts. Try to write them down. What are the thoughts that make you weep? What are those feelings that you might have that make you lose hope? What are the needs that you have that maybe are not met during this time? The need to go out, the need to socialize, or the need to connect. Name those needs. What are the desires that you have that even though you might be stuck at home, your desire for life has not changed. It's still there. Write them down. What do you want? I think it's beautiful in the midst of the needs, in the midst of the desires, to write what do you really want out of this time of lockdown or staying at home or pandemic. What do you want? Don't be a passive victim. One thing I understood was also not to let myself be a victim and become passive during this time. Be aware of what you want. Work for it also while you are at home. Whether it's in the level of your work or your relationships, what do you want? And more importantly, what do you decide? What have you decided to do during this time in the midst of pondering about your own personal situation in terms of your physical needs or desires, in terms of your emotional needs as well, in terms of your spiritual needs? What have you decided to do during this time? Okay, so that is more on the personal level, on the first question with the encounter between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Now, I'd like to also touch on the second one, the second question that Jesus asked, if you remember, the disciples on the road to Emmaus, or Emmaus, in Luke 24, verses 13 and following. And the question he asked them was, what are these things that you are talking about amongst yourselves along the way? So what are these things that you're talking about amongst yourselves? So in somehow, Jesus is trying to introduce himself into our conversations. How can we also examine in our conversations, in our relationships, in other words, how we are? What are the things you talk about normally? There you can sense where you are as well in your relationships. Okay, it lets you know a bit about yourself, but also it lets you know about the quality of your relationships. What do you normally talk about? And you can bring in the same questions that I gave about your thoughts, your feelings, your desires, what you want. So what would you want to introduce into your relationships during this time? So if you remember, on one day I was also speaking about different levels of relationships. So introducing Jesus into our relationships could be on the intimate level, which means at home with the people you live with. Have you decided something about the way you want to treat each other, or the way you want to react or to respond to certain comments that somebody makes at home, to a certain behavior? Maybe you yourself have decided, I don't want to keep reacting, but I want to live in a different way. So that could be one thing that we can ponder on the level of relationships with others. So the first was about yourself. The second day, we talked about your relationship with others. And of course, when we are at home, it doesn't mean we're by ourselves only with our families. So you can think also in terms of your professional relationships. You have to work still. How do you live those relationships with people you work with now? Even though it's online or it's virtual, in whatever way, So it could be on intimate relationships, your professional relationships, could be your social relationships, meaning relatives, friends, society in general, to be more conscious of the way we want to be agents of hope in the midst of our society, or the people we meet. And then also we talked about nature and the needy, the poor. So when we talk about relationships with others, let's not forget the ones who are weakest. So it's basically those who are less fortunate than us and the environment itself. That we should not forget that there's a certain level of care we need to have for our environment and the poor. As we were saying, what do they have in common? The poor and the environment is that they're both helpless. So Christian life speaks also about giving a hand there. So that's the second level. And if you notice, these are not easy questions to answer. That's why I'm suggesting that you could take a longer time of prayer to ponder on these questions. You don't have to do it all in one day. Since they're in different dimensions, you can even divide it in different days. But I think it's really worthwhile to spend time to think about each dimension, personal, and then in your relationships, so that you can really come out with a concrete awareness of how you want to live these different dimensions during this time to maintain a healthy environment in yourself and with others as well. Now, the third question of Jesus, we move on, is when Jesus appeared to the community after the disciples announced their experience on Emmaus. Along the way to Emmaus, they expressed this experience to the community, and then Jesus appeared to them. And he asked them here two questions that are related. One is, why are you having these doubts in your hearts? Okay, so you've been told everything and you're still doubting. And the second question is, have you anything to eat? On this third question, we are pondering a bit more on our missionary dimension. So the first dimension is personal, about yourself, your spiritual, emotional, and physical needs. Second was about your relationships, the way you deal with others, whether at home, at work, with our social relationships, or with nature and with the poor. And this third one talks about our mission to the world. And in concrete, it's about our gifts. This time of pandemic can be very helpful also as a time to discover our gifts. What we can offer to society, to our families, to our world. Some of us are learning music. Some of us are picking up reading. Some are writing. So there are different things that we can develop as gifts during this time of being at home as well. So when Jesus asks, have you anything to eat? He's asking us to nourish his body. And as we have prayed before, his body means the members of his body, as we are one body in Christ. He's asking us to nourish other people with our gifts, to help them, in other words. So what are the gifts that you have discovered during this time? How can you develop them? And what needs are you sensitive to? They say that when you see a need and you have a talent to cover that need, that makes a call. So a need and a talent to cover that need is a calling from Christ. So I think it's as simple as that. We might complicate things a bit more about whether I want to, whether I don't want to. Of course, our personal freedom comes in, our faith. But the fact is that there is a need, and you have that talent to attend to that need. So it's, in a Christian sense, we would say that the Lord is calling us to offer our services as well to others. So what is that talent? What is the need you see? Sometimes it's a need for peacemaking, and you have a talent for mediation. Or it's a need for communication, and you have a talent for better communication, perhaps. Or it could be a need for organization, and you're very good at managing. So whenever there's a need, and you see that you have a talent, it could be, we could have resistances, and we could have our doubts. That's why Jesus asked, why are you doubting? No, we could have our uh, I don't want to, or I don't feel like I'm the one. But the fact is, we see a need and we see our possibilities to attend to it. And I would encourage you to also ponder about that, to pray about that in this third question of Jesus. Do you have something to nourish me with? And to be honest and to pray about it as well, what that call could be for you, or what mission. And lastly, the encounter between Jesus and the 7 who went back fishing. Peter was one of them. In fact, he was the leader, and he brought them all fishing, like going back to the old life. And Jesus asked here, friends or children, have you caught anything to eat? So are you satisfied? So here is quite an interesting point where Jesus invites us to meet him or to recognize him in our dissatisfaction or in our failures even. In areas where we feel frustrated, there could be an invitation to know him more as well. So it's precisely where they failed, the disciples felt that they failed their mission, they couldn't catch any fish, and Jesus invites them to fish on the right side. Throw your nets on the right side. It's a kind of nice connotation there. You're throwing it on the wrong side. Throw it on the right side. And they caught the catch. So, how can we, in these experiences, not to run away from our experiences of failure, failed attempts, or areas where we feel unsatisfied, but to allow Jesus to teach us there how to learn from our failures, how to learn from our dissatisfaction in order to find the right way to satisfy ourselves. Okay, so it could be in different dimensions. As I was saying, with the 11 dimensions of our project of life, we could try to look there, Spiritually, am I satisfied? Physically, emotionally. In terms of my profession, am I professionally satisfied? In terms of my intellectual formation, education, in terms of my apostolate, my finances, all those different dimensions that I mentioned there. How is our level of satisfaction? Are we frustrated in some points? It could be nice during this time of pandemic to allow ourselves to, not to dwell, but to just be aware. And maybe the Lord is asking us to learn a way to work out those frustrations or points of dissatisfaction. So even pain and sadness, Peter and the others were sad with the death of Jesus. What are your sadnesses? What are your pains? Even darkness. They were fishing in the night. So how to learn to deal with the darkness when we don't see the light? We don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. How is the Lord inviting you to learn how to live with darkness, hoping for the light as well? So this is kind of, the last question is kind of profound, I would say, but at the same time very practical. To learn how to live with frustrations, to bear frustrations in life, and to learn from our failures and mistakes. And this could be a good time to ponder on them as well. So those are the 4 questions. As I said, please take time. You don't have to finish all of them in one day, but it's really worth to ponder all 4 of them separately with the guide of the 11 dimensions of a project of life. You don't have to do all of them. Just choose the ones that are more pertinent for you and useful for your life. You know best with the Lord what are your needs. So just to summarize once again, the summary of the summary of just one attitude that I'd like to invite you to have, that we can learn from all these resurrection experiences. And it's about our religion, Christian religion. That our religion, more than a religion of seeing, is a religion of listening. More than believing because of what we see, we believe because we listen to God. And if you look through all the different dimensions that I went through, the four of them, you will notice that everything has to do with listening. And everything, all the encounters have to do with the disciples not recognizing Jesus even though they saw him. For example, Mary Magdalene. She saw him and she thought he was the gardener, if you remember. It was until he called her name, Mary, she turned around and she recognized him. So it was not about seeing, it was about listening to him. And this is what the analogy that we've been using a lot also during this time when we can't go to Mass. Because the Mass is a lot, sometimes we get used to seeing. We want something tangible. And the Pope was inviting all of us also during this time and the whole church, go back to listening to the Word of God. Because we meet God more by listening than seeing. And that's why in prayer we are taught to listen. And this works in our relationships as well. If you learn how to listen to the other person, you'll bear a lot more fruit in your relationship. It will grow more than just basing on what you see. Okay? Learning to listen deeply. So it happened to the walk to Emmaus. They were able to recognize Jesus because they were listening to him along the way. Listening to the scriptures. If you remember, he was explaining the scriptures from Moses and through the prophets, etc. about himself. And they listened. And that's why they could recognize him. When they went back, also the third case about the community, how were they able to meet Jesus? Why did he appear to them? Because they listened to the testimony of these two who came back. They came back and they told the story to those who were hiding still with fear. And because of the strength of their testimony of what they shared, and they listened, they recognized Jesus in their midst. It says Jesus appeared. But actually Jesus is always around. But we don't see him. We don't recognize him. And we need to listen, not just to him in our prayer, not just to ourselves, but as well to others who talk to him, who talk to us about him. And lastly, if you see the same, Jesus, they appeared on the shore when they were fishing, and the disciples didn't recognize him. Until the moment he told them, cast your nets on the other side, on the right side. And only when they obeyed him, when they obeyed his voice, they saw the catch, and one of the disciples said, it is the Lord. They recognized him because they obeyed his voice. So it goes even deeper in this sense on the last passage of John 21, because it's not just about listening, but obeying the voice. And in the measure that we obey the voice that we hear, telling us not to change course, don't cast on the wrong side, cast on the right side. And we were invited to ask, when I do something, do I do it out of my own whim? Or is it because the Lord is telling me it? To learn to listen to what he says, to cast our nets on the right side, and to obey him. And when we see the fruits, we will recognize his risen presence. So in summary, all this talks about the importance of listening. Our religion is not so much a religion of seeing. It's really a religion of listening. Learning how to listen to God, especially through his word, especially through the testimony of others who live a life of faith, and trying to obey that voice. And then, after that, we will see in the sense of we recognize the risen Lord. So that's it. So I hope you have enjoyed these reflections of Easter Octave, and I hope this summary has helped. And I really encourage you, just go through the things slowly, no rush. You can go back to the videos that have helped you, and you'll really have a fruitful Easter time to recognize the risen presence of Christ, to be agents of hope, first to ourselves, to people in our relationships, and how to bring that hope into the world. So, happy Easter once more. The Lord is truly risen amongst us, and as Christians, we just have to allow ourselves to recognize that presence he brings. So God bless you, and have a blessed Easter season.